The beauty shop on Macon Street had been there longer than most of the marriages in our town. Lena's cut and color, hand-painted sign above the door, blue letters faded from years of Georgia sun. I had been going there every third Saturday for 11 years. It was the kind of place where you knew everyone's business before you even sat down in the chair, and nobody minded. That particular Saturday in October, I was running late. My daughter had called twice that morning, once to ask about Thanksgiving plans, once to ask, very casually, whether I had talked to a lawyer recently about the house. I remember standing in the kitchen with my coffee going cold, thinking that was a strange thing to ask at 8:30 in the morning. I told her no. She said, "Okay, just wondering." And then she hung up. I should have paid more attention to that feeling in my chest, that small, quiet tightening. But I brushed my hair, put on my good earrings, and drove to Lena's. The shop was busy. 2 women under dryers, someone getting a wash at the back sink, the usual smell of relaxer and sweet tea. I took my seat by the window and picked up a magazine I had no intention of reading, and that is when the woman beside me leaned over. I did not know her. She was perhaps 70, maybe older, with wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of posture you only see in women who were raised to sit up straight. She was waiting for her color to set, a plastic cap on her head, completely unbothered. She said, "You're Eleanor Marsh." It was not a question. I said yes. She reached into the canvas bag at her feet and pulled out a plain white envelope, sealed, with nothing written on the front. She held it out to me. "Your husband asked me to give this to you," she said. "He said you would need it, sooner than you think." My husband had been dead for 14 months. I stared at her. She held the envelope steady, not unkind, just patient. I took it. I don't know why. My hands were shaking, though I didn't notice that until I was already holding it. I said, "Who are you?" She said her name was Frances Webb, and that she and my husband had gone to the same church for 23 years, that he had come to her 8 months before he passed and asked her to hold something for him, that he had been very specific about the timing. She said, "He told me to wait until you really needed it. I've been watching and praying ever since." She paused. "I think now is the right time." Then her stylist called her name from the back, and she stood up, straightened her blouse, and walked away. I sat there for a long time with that envelope in my lap. My husband's name was Leonard. Leonard James Marsh. 51 years, we were married. He was a quiet man, an accountant by trade, careful with money, careful with words, careful with most things except the garden, which he kept wild on purpose. He said controlled things should stay inside the house. Outside, he said, things have the right to grow how they grow. Leonard died of a stroke in August of the year before last. Quick, the doctor said. He most likely didn't suffer. I held on to those words for a long time because there was not much else to hold on to. We had 2 children, a son who lives in Portland now and calls on birthdays and sometimes Christmas, and a daughter, Faye. Faye had always been the one who was present. She lived 20 minutes away. She came to Sunday dinners. She knew where I kept the spare key, where the water shut-off valve was, the name of my doctor. After Leonard died, she was there every week, sometimes twice. She brought groceries. She sat with me. I was grateful. I told people how grateful I was. I sat in that beauty shop chair, and I put the envelope in my purse without opening it. Lena called me over, and I sat down, and she worked on my hair, and I answered her questions about how I was doing. And I said, "Fine, fine, I'm doing fine." I drove home. I made lunch. I sat at the kitchen table. I opened the envelope. Inside was a folded piece of paper, Leonard's handwriting, which I knew better than my own. He had a way of pressing too hard with the pen, so every word left a slight groove in the paper underneath. I used to tease him about that. I smoothed the paper flat against the table. He had written, "Eleanor, if Francis gave you this, then things have started to move in a direction I hoped they wouldn't. Before you do anything else, go to the cedar chest in the hall closet. Bottom tray, under the winter quilts. There is a brown envelope. Take it to Arthur Baines. You remember Arthur. Trust him completely. He is the only one you need right now. I am sorry I couldn't tell you myself. I didn't want to worry you before there was anything to worry about. I love you. L. I read it 3 times. Then I went to the hall closet. The cedar chest had been there since we moved into the house in 1987. I had not opened it in years. I lifted the lid and folded back the quilts, the heavy ones with the yellow stitching that his mother had made, and at the bottom, pressed flat against the cedar wood, was a brown envelope, thick, sealed with packing tape. I did not open it. I did not sleep that night. I knew Arthur Baines. He had been Leonard's attorney for close to 30 years, a small man with a calm voice who had handled our wills and the refinancing of the house and various other matters over the decades. He had come to Leonard's funeral. He had shaken my hand and said something kind. I had his number in the book by the phone. I called him first thing, Monday morning. He did not sound surprised to hear from me. He said, "Eleanor, I've been expecting your call." He told me to come in at 2 o'clock and to bring the brown envelope and not to discuss it with anyone first. I asked him if he could tell me what was inside it. He said, "Your husband will explain." The drive to Arthur's office took me through the part of town where Faye lived. I slowed down when I passed her street without meaning to. Her car was in the driveway. I thought about stopping. I thought about how she'd come over the previous Sunday and walk through the house the way she sometimes did, pausing in doorways, asking questions about what I planned to do with this room or that one. At the time, I thought she was concerned. I thought she was being loving. I kept driving. Arthur's office was above a dry goods store on the square, same location for decades. His secretary brought me coffee and left me alone. When Arthur came out, he shook my hand and held it a moment, and something in his expression made me set down the coffee cup because I could see I was going to need both hands free. He took the brown envelope. He opened it carefully. Inside was a stack of papers and a small USB drive taped to an index card in Leonard's handwriting. He laid everything on the desk. He said, "I'll walk you through all of this, but let me start by telling you the most important thing." He looked at me across the desk. "Your husband changed his will 14 months before he died. What you were shown after his death was not the final version." I said, "I don't understand." He said, "The will that was filed, that Faye had filed, was an earlier draft. She had a copy of it from several years ago. Leonard made significant changes to the final document and kept the original here with me, separate from anything she had access to. He was not certain she would do anything, but he was not willing to leave you unprotected just in case." I sat with that for a moment. "What did she do?" I asked. Arthur was quiet for a second. Then he said, "After the funeral, she contacted the county probate office and submitted the earlier will as the final document, the one she had. It left the house and most of the liquid assets split equally between the two of you." He paused. "The final will left the house entirely to you, with specific provisions to ensure it could not be transferred or sold without a series of legal steps that she would have no standing to initiate." Leonard was very thorough. I thought about the phone call that Saturday morning. "Have you talked to a lawyer recently about the house?" I thought about all the Sundays she had walked through the rooms. I said, "She already knew she'd filed the wrong one?" Arthur said, "I believe she was testing how much you knew." Leonard had prepared everything. The USB drive contained copies of bank statements, property records, and a recorded conversation, Leonard's voice on a small device he had apparently kept in his desk drawer during a discussion with Faye about the estate 6 months before he died. He had not told me about that conversation. I did not know it had happened. On the recording, Faye asked him directly what would happen to the house when he was gone. She asked whether my name was the only one on the deed. She asked whether I had considered moving somewhere smaller, somewhere easier to manage. Her voice was gentle the whole time. That was the part that stayed with me. How gentle she sounded. Leonard answered her questions carefully. He did not tell her about the changes he had made. He did not tell her about Arthur, or the brown envelope, or Francis Webb at the church. He just answered her questions in his slow, deliberate way, and at the end he said, "Eleanor will be taken care of. You don't need to worry about any of that." I sat in Arthur's office and listened to my dead husband's voice, and I did not cry, which surprised me. I think I was past the part that makes you cry. I was in some other part, quieter and colder and very, very still. Arthur said that with the correct will and the documentation on the drive, phase filing could be challenged and overturned. He said it would not be a short process, but it would be a clear one. He had already begun preparing the paperwork when Leonard gave him the envelope 2 years prior. He had been waiting. I asked him why Leonard had not simply told me, why he had arranged it this way, through Francis, through the envelope, through all of it. Arthur was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He told me he didn't want you to go through your marriage knowing what he suspected your daughter might do. He wanted you to have those years without that. He thought, he hoped, that he might be wrong, that he was being overly cautious. He said if he was wrong, you'd never need to open the envelope at all." He paused. He wasn't willing to leave it to chance. I drove home a different way that time, down through that county road where Leonard used to take his evening walks, past the old Fulton property that had been farmland since before either of us was born. I rolled the window down even though it was cold, because I needed the air. I did not call Faye. I did not call my son. I went home and I sat on the back porch in the cold, and I looked at the garden, which had gone to seed the way it always did in October, the way Leonard would have wanted. Wild, growing how it grew. The legal process took 7 months. Faye hired an attorney of her own. There were letters and depositions, and one afternoon when we were both in a conference room on opposite sides of a long table and she looked at me and said, "I just wanted to make sure you were protected, Mama. That's all I ever wanted." I looked back at her. I thought about the recording. I thought about the gentleness in her voice, asking about the deed. I said, "I know you believe that. I did not say anything else. The judge ruled in my favor in May. The house remained in my name, fully and without condition, exactly as Leonard had intended. The earlier will was nullified." Faye did not speak to me for several months after, and when she finally called, it was to say she was sorry, that she had made a terrible mistake, that the money had never been about the money. I listened to all of it. I did not tell her it was all right, because it wasn't, and I have never been willing to say things that aren't true just to make a moment easier. I told her I heard her. I told her I needed more time. I told her the door was not closed, but I needed to be the one to open it when I was ready. She said, "Okay, Mama." We hung up. I went to the cemetery the following Sunday. Not for any particular reason, just because I wanted to. I brought flowers from the garden, the last of the marigolds, which had done well that year. I stood there in the quiet for a while and thought about what kind of man plans ahead like that, so carefully and so quietly, not to protect himself, but to protect a person he was leaving behind. Who arranges for a woman named Frances to sit in a beauty shop and wait until the time was right. I thought about the groove his pen made in the paper. Every word. I set the marigolds down. I said, "You were right." I needed it. The drive home was easy. The leaves were starting to come back in. Georgia in spring looks like it's trying to apologize for winter, and that year it was working. I went home and unlocked the front door that had always been mine. I went inside. I have thought a lot about what it means to truly protect someone you love, not the kind of protection that shows up loudly, that announces itself, that needs to be thanked, but the quiet kind, the kind that works even after you're gone. Leonard never told me what he suspected. Not once. We had 51 years of breakfasts and arguments and silences and Sunday drives, and in all of that time he saw something I didn't see, and he chose to carry it alone so I wouldn't have to. I used to think that was a kind of sadness, that he bore it by himself. Now I think it was one of the most intelligent things he ever did. He understood that knowing too early would have changed everything between Faye and me, would have colored every Sunday dinner, every phone call, every moment I might have otherwise had with my daughter without suspicion sitting between us. He gave me those years clean. That was his gift. What Faye did, I have had to sit with it for a long time without rushing toward a conclusion. She is not a monster. I don't believe that. I think she looked at that house and that land and saw something she wanted, and she told herself a story about why it was reasonable to want it, and then she let that story grow until it felt like justification. That is how most harm happens between people who once loved each other. Not with malice from the beginning, but with a small dishonesty that gets protected and fed until it becomes something larger and harder to walk back from. The thing about cause and effect is that it doesn't announce itself. It just moves. Faye made a choice when she filed that old will. She made another choice every time she walked through my house asking questions she already knew the answers to. Each of those choices set something in motion. And Leonard, years before, had made his own choices, careful, quiet, unglamorous choices about envelopes and attorneys, and a woman named Frances who would sit in a beauty shop and wait for the right moment. Both sets of choices arrived at the same place. That is not luck. That is how things actually work. What I carry with me now is this: honesty is not just a moral position, it is a practical one. Faye's dishonesty cost her more than she calculated. It cost her the house she wanted, yes, but it also cost her something that cannot be filed in any court: her mother's uncomplicated love. I still love her. I do. But it is a different shape now, and she made it that shape, not me. And for myself, what I learned is that resilience is not about being unaffected. I was affected. I sat on that back porch in the cold, and I felt things I don't have clean words for. Resilience is about continuing to move after you felt all of it, about driving to the attorney, about standing in the conference room and saying the true thing instead of the easy thing, about going to the cemetery with marigolds and saying out loud, to no one and to the one person who would have understood, that he was right. I unlocked my front door that spring and walked into my own house. And it was just a house. Old floors, the garden growing wild out back, the cedar chest in the hall closet. But it was mine, fully and without condition. That is what careful choices, made with love and integrity, can build. A life that holds even when everything tries to pull it apart.